I want to start with, to just contextualize the project historically. The project is about scientific study of religion, but the kind of approach to scientific study of religion that is about this cognitive science of religion is relatively new. The study of religion, at least in the Western world, used to be done primarily in divinity schools. It was part of training for clergy, for religious leaders. And this was the case up until about the 1960s, when the first sort of secular departments of religion started being established. And so this was the first time that the study of religion started to take more of an outsider's view of what religion is. Sorry, I'm walking in front of the projector, as opposed to an insider's view. Okay? And some of these, they're sometimes called religionists, people who study religion, wanted generalizable explanatory theories, testable theories, of why people are religious. Okay? Why does religious expression look the way it does, similarly across different cultural groups, but also why the differences. Okay? And one of the I've highlighted empirically testable theories, because there was a growing need, even in the 1960s, but certainly in the 70s and 80s, to actually be able to empirically test out with evidence why it is that people are religious, or why it is that they're attracted to certain kinds of rituals or certain kinds of beliefs. And a growing sort of feeling in the 70s that there was a problem with some of the standard old explanations of why people tend to be religious, including the Marxist style explanations, or the comfort theory that I'm sure a lot of you are aware of. I was just talking to one of the staff here hosting us here at Disneyland Hotel, and she gave the sort of standard, well, people are religious because it gives them comfort. Well, it's a common idea, and I'm not saying that it's entirely false. But when we start looking around at the sorts of things that people believe in, some of them are actually terrifying and aren't comforting at all. And we've also observed that in a lot of places where, say, their economic prosperity grows, sometimes their religiosity grows along with it, which goes, and actually China is a nice case in point. And so it doesn't look like comfort is good enough to explain the particulars of religious belief and their distribution all the time. Again, I'm not saying the comfort theory doesn't have a little bit to offer, but we need something else that's going to stand up to an empirical test. Thank you. There have been a number of other attempts, of course, that some of you are familiar with, in explaining why it is people tend to have religious beliefs. I mentioned the Marxist and other comfort approaches. There have also been a rich history of what you might call pathology approaches, that there's something that goes wrong with the human brain, or there's some kind of disease in your head that makes you religious. And actually, some of these are common today. I put up this little slide of these cave paintings because one of the explanations for where religion came from is from either hallucinogenic drugs that led to these kinds of experiences, or some kind of brain pathology, something gone wrong with the brain, probably temporal lobe epilepsy or something like that, right? That led to weird dreams and hallucinations that gave rise to shamanism, that then was the early precursor of today's religious beliefs. Okay? These accounts actually are not terribly helpful, in my opinion, because they don't account for why is it that the vast majority of humans all over the world have religious intuitions, impulses, and behaviors. Okay? We aren't all sick in the head, all right? We aren't all suffering from pathology. So there's a serious inadequacy here with these sort of pathology approaches. I put Freud up because, of course, he thought there was something natural about religion, but naturally wrong about it. That there's some kind of developmental problem that leads to religious expression. But none of these accounts actually have very good evidence to back them up. Another common account for why people are religious that you often see, I've labeled simple indoctrination. And this is the idea, and has actually been encouraged in some ways by the social sciences, that people are religious because they've been brainwashed. They've simply been indoctrinated. Put them in the right social environment and tell them there's a God, there's a God, there's a God, there's a God, and people believe it. Well, certainly it's the case that indoctrination matters. What you get taught matters. No doubt about that. But it doesn't account for why is it that across cultures, throughout human history, we see recurrent patterns of religious expression over and over again. And why is it that many religious beliefs and practices actually run exactly counter to what people have been taught by authority figures? Okay? That in some cultural environments, when the authority figures, the state, the educational system tries to teach against religion, it still keeps popping up. Something else is going on here. Given those kinds of concerns, then in the 1970s, a couple of seminal figures who were interested in studying religion, I've put up a picture of E. Thomas Lawson, who was a comparative religionist, studied African religions primarily, and Dan Sperber from Paris, who was an anthropologist as well. They both started wondering, well, maybe there's some resources in these newly emerging cognitive sciences, mind sciences, for understanding why people are religious. Lawson was inspired by the work of Noam Chomsky in the area of study of language, where Chomsky was showing that there seems to be some kind of natural language acquisition device in people's heads, just naturally, that then gets filled in by cultural content. And he wondered, is there something similar going on for religious rituals? Okay, that there's common sort of mental capacities that people have that then gets developed by the cultural environment that helps structure the way we think about ritual. Dan Sperber started looking at, well, how can we understand symbolism in a more psychologically informed way? Importantly, both of these thinkers rejected a radical psychological relativism. Okay, they rejected the idea that the way that your mind works is completely determined by the cultural environment that you're in. They said, no, there's some kind of important interchange there. That by virtue of being human beings, okay, having a common biology, and living in the kind of world we do, having a common ecology for the most part, that there are at least certain kinds of broad parameters that we all have in common. Okay, so they rejected the idea that we're just culturally constructed from the ground up. One of the earliest papers that we can still see a continuity with contemporary cognitive science and religion is work by Stuart Guthrie, who revitalized this anthropomorphism hypothesis, right? That humans have a natural tendency to see the world in human-like terms. That's what that fancy term anthropomorphism means. Okay? But he was one of the first ones to link this to normal, evolved mental mechanisms. Okay? And he argued that actually it was adaptive for our ancestors to think about the world in human-like terms. And he's actually still lecturing and writing on this thing today. In the 1990s, we saw a few books that were starting to use this cognitive approach to the study of religion. Tom Lawson, who I put up there, and Bob McCauley's 1990 book, Rethinking Religion, Stuart Guthrie's book, Faces in the Clouds, Pascal Boyer's 94 book, The Naturalness of Religious Beliefs, and Harvey Whitehouse's book, Inside the Cult, which actually focused on a Melanesian group. It was an ethnography, but he used insights from cognitive psychology to explain the dynamics that he saw on the ground. In 2000, I had the pleasure of actually naming this area, cognitive science and religion, in a Trends in Cognitive Science article. And then we saw in the 2000s a rapid rise of interest in this area, particularly because of the events of 9/11, okay, and understanding that, well, religion actually motivates people. The scholars kind of woke up and said, wow, religion matters. Who knew? Which is kind of funny. And psychologists finally started getting involved and bringing a little bit more empirical and, a little bit more scientific rigor to the theoretical discussion that had been going on. So cognitive science of religion, short definition, Brian Hornbeck will say more about this, but draws upon the cognitive sciences to explain how culturally recurrent features of human minds and their natural and social environments inform and constrain religious thought and action. And further, how do particular religious, cultural, and environmental factors stretch or modify those cognitive defaults? Okay? And like I said, Brian Hornbeck will tell us more about that. But what that history tells us, a couple of important things about cognitive science and religion, is it started by religion scholars trained in the humanities, not trained in the sciences. Okay, and I understand most of you actually are coming from the humanities. So that's important to know. You're in good company. Right? That's who started this. There were only a few cognitive scientists or psychologists involved for many years. There's also an emphasis on an outsider approach as opposed to an insider approach. So even those of us who work in the area who are religious take this sort of outsider approach to studying religion, okay? Looking in from the outside. And the original focus was on general patterns in religion, with some exceptions. There were some sort of looking deep at particulars in cultural settings. But it was not supposed to be tradition specific, and certainly not focused on Western religions. Okay, I mentioned that one of the, arguably the founder of the area, Tom Lawson, is actually an African religion scholar, and that's important to note. Nevertheless, most of the research has been done in the West. We can also see this project in the cognitive science of religion as an extension of a discussion that's been going on for hundreds of years, and here sort of represented by David Hume's quote concerning religion. There are two questions which challenge our attention, to which that concerning its foundation, that is religion's foundation in reason, and that concerning its origin in human nature. Okay, so he's trying to make a distinction between reasons for why someone believes versus the causes that lead people to religious belief and action. Okay, so cognitive science of religion is about the causes. Can we explain why people have tendencies toward belief? Not whether it's reasonable to believe. We'll put that on the shelf for now. Okay? It focuses on these causes, and that's important to know because cognitive science then is not an apologetic. It's not an argument for religion or against. It's a scientific study of this human phenomenon we call religion. Well, in this new area, we've seen a bit of a consensus starting to form, even though it's an area of only about 20 years old. And that consensus is on, well, the thesis of this conference and the project, and that's the naturalness of religion thesis. That is, somehow, religious expression seems to be the path of least resistance of human minds. Okay? It was sort of captured in this 2007 issue of the New Scientist magazine, cover title there, Born Believers. And in this article, Michael Brooks asked Paul Bloom, would a group of children raised in isolation spontaneously create their own religious beliefs? And Paul Bloom, the Yale developmental psychologist, said, yeah, I think the answer is yes, which is an interesting, provocative idea. I don't think we're going to any time put a bunch of kids on an island and see what happens. As much fun as that would be. By virtue of having ordinary human minds in ordinary human environments, people are generally receptive to many religious ideas. The existence of gods, a human soul or spirit, and an afterlife are examples of that. That's the naturalist thesis in a nutshell. Okay? Pascal Boyer put it this way: some form of religious thinking seems to be the path of least resistance for our cognitive systems. Okay? It's easy to go that way. It takes extra resources not to think religiously, or special cultural conditions to not think religiously. And that was an interesting, provocative claim. Bloom, again, this is the title of an article he wrote in 2007, Religion is Natural. Robert Macaulay from Emory University in 2011 had the book, Why Religion is Natural and Science Isn't, with Oxford University Press, and he's a philosopher of science and a big fan of science. He's saying, look, there's something very unusual going on to think about science. Jesse Barrett's book, The Belief Instinct, sort of captures that idea as well. Right? We have an instinct for religious belief, and he's an atheist writing this. And then my book in 2012, Born Believers, you'll hear more about some of my thinking on that. But there's something very natural about religion. But is the naturalist thesis right? Most of the experimental work supporting this thesis was actually gathered in the West, or at least in countries where there's, religion is common, it's accepted, it's in the air. Almost none of it comes from predominantly secular cultures. There are a couple of exceptions, but most of it is not. And a few years ago when Ryan and I were dreaming up this project, lots of people would challenge us with, well, what about China? If religion is so natural, why is the largest nation on earth largely secular? What's going on there? Isn't that a problem for this thesis? So we put together this project. And it's included 23 scholars from psychology, anthropology, philosophy, and Chinese studies from 13 different institutions, including Chinese Academy of Sciences, Oxford, Boston University, the University of British Columbia, Cal State Fullerton, Fuller's Graduate Schools, among others. With 29 different studies using lots of different methods, including ethnography, textual studies, experimental studies, developmental studies, thousands of participants ranging in age really from 3 to 82 years old, and dozens of texts over thousands of years old, all right, ranging over 1,000 years, some of them more than 2,200 years old, all right. So we've taken a multidisciplinary, multinational, collaborative effort to explore this question: is religion natural? And today's conference, then, you get sort of the early glimpse at what we're finding to answer this question. The next thing we want to do then is give you a little bit more background on what are some of the theoretical underpinnings of this cognitive science of religion approach, and then we'll launch into the individual work packages. And to give that introduction, I'll turn it over to Ryan.
Okay, hi guys, thank you Justin, and many warm thanks to you all for joining us here today. My name is Ryan. I think I've already met most of you. I am a research faculty at Fuller Graduate School of Psychology, and along with Justin, a co-organizer of this research project. And Justin has just given us a fine introduction into the context in which cognitive science of religion, or CSR, came of age as an approach to the study of religion. And for the next 15 minutes, or maybe a little less than that since we're already way over time, I just wanted to review some very basic characteristics of CSR research to help you make sense of today's presentations. And if I fail you in that, or if you still find yourself confused about the big ideas structuring some of today's talks, please certainly ask us questions during the question and answer session, during coffee afterwards. I also would invite you to take a look. I think you might have been given one of these coming in. Justin's article, Introducing Cognitive Science of Religion. The first few pages are very, very helpful in terms of giving a general introduction to this research area. And we actually have this translated into Chinese, and someone is out printing it off right now. We will have that ready during lunch. Thank you. And all I want to do here very quickly is just run over this definition Justin gave you and offer a few clarifications and explanations, added explanations, before I pass things off to Deb, who's standing by in Boston. As Justin told you, the cognitive science of religion, we'll just call it CSR, is an approach to the study of religion that draws upon the mind sciences to explain how universal features of human minds, interacting with natural and social environments, inform and constrain religious thought and action. So first of all, what do we mean by the mind sciences? What types of schools of thought are typically represented in CSR? And in principle, any school of thought that formulates testable hypotheses about the nature and workings of human minds is fair game. But in practice, philosophy of mind, cognitive, developmental, and evolutionary psychology, and computer science, most CSR research draws from these schools of thought. And what does CSR mean by universal features of human minds? Well, in the mind sciences, in the last 40 years, there's been a lot of research converging on the idea that we all share very similar ways of reasoning about the world, regardless of the cultural context in which we develop. Okay? And in CSR literature and in today's talks, you might hear some of these words: intuitions, cognitive biases, tendencies, and predilections. Cognitive mechanisms or devices or systems, and mental tools, type 1 processing, and a crude but for today's purposes perhaps somewhat useful term, instincts. Now these are not dictionary synonyms. These words have different meanings, and different CSR researchers may attach very different meanings to the exact same term. But typically, all of these terms refer to mental processes that are specialized for specific information processing tasks, So we might have a cognitive mechanism for detecting predators. We might have a cognitive mechanism for reasoning about intentionality in others that reliably develop in all human minds, regardless of cultural environment, that structure at some deep level our way of thinking about the world, that influence us as in terms of what we find interesting, what we find memorable, what we want to talk to our friends about, and that operate quickly, effortlessly, and often without our awareness. So here's an example. Humans seem to have a cognitive mechanism dedicated to processing faces. First of all, we like to look at faces. Babies show preferential attention to faces in almost all experimental circumstances. You can show them lots of things. You can show them faces. You can show them toys. And they almost always prefer to look at faces. They find faces intrinsically interesting. They want to look at them. And second of all, we're very good at processing faces. So just to demonstrate, if I just ask you to look at these two images, and which do you find it easier to do? To recognize the person in this picture, or to perform this fairly simple arithmetic task? Most of us can rather instantly recognize David Beckham here, but calculating 582 times 947 requires a little time, maybe pencil and paper, but certainly for me. But as a computational task, recognizing a face is much, much, much more complex, okay? Kind of matching all these features to an image set down in memory a long time ago requires very powerful processing tools. You can imagine the different computers necessary to perform these tasks. Computers can recognize faces, okay, but it takes a sophisticated software program. Computers can also perform simple arithmetic, but you can just do that with a garden variety calculator. So these are just some basic ideas. This is just an example demonstrating some of the properties I talked about. But during today's talks, if you hear someone talk about intuitions or cognitive mechanisms or these types of things, you might keep these properties in mind and wonder how the systems they're talking about might influence us towards religious expression. Oh, sorry. And then finally, how does CSR, or not finally, penultimately, how does CSR define religious thought and action? Typically, CSR researchers have tried to avoid defining religion in some very large, all-encompassing way. We typically approach religion in a piecemeal or a ling sui fashion, and look at things like God, spirits, or other supernatural agents, afterlife beliefs, rituals, creation myths, and these kinds of things. Okay, and finally, so how might these universal features of human minds, how might they inform and constrain religious thought and action? I'll just very, very briefly mention two approaches today that together cover an awful lot of ground in CSR. First, the byproduct approach proposes that religious concepts are a byproduct of ordinary natural cognitive devices. And in about 2 minutes, I'm going to hand this over to Deb Kellerman, who's standing by down here in the bottom of the screen. And she's going to discuss her work on our seemingly intuitive tendency to reason about non-living natural objects like mountains and rainstorms in terms of design and purpose. And as you listen to her talk, you can imagine that if, as a species, we do demonstrate these reasoning tendencies, they would have a profound effect on our receptivity to the idea that the world might have been created by some supernatural agent. And ultimately, we think her work offers a lot of insights into our species' deep history with creator deity concepts and creation myths. And second, the adaptation approach proposes that religious concepts confer fitness advantages by fostering cooperation between genetically unrelated strangers. So right after Deb, Ryan Nichols will talk and tell us about some possible social cooperation advantages attendant to believing in gods that watch us and that reward virtuous behaviors, good behaviors, and more importantly, that punish bad behaviors. So before the advent of court systems and governments, it might have been the case that large-scale human cooperation just wasn't possible without these types of concepts. I'll let him tell you more about that. And these two approaches are not exclusive. Some religious concepts may have started out as a byproduct of our intuitions, and then later have been developed in ways that conferred fitness advantages. Okay, so that was 14 minutes.